This is a powerful and disturbing script. I will paraphrase it by subtly changing the word order and sentence structure while preserving the evocative language and narrative intensity. The Cursed Daughter of Kentucky. In the summer of 1952, a social worker named Margaret Hensley drove her government-issued Ford deep into the Kentucky mountains, following a winding dirt road. She was following up on reports that had crossed her desk 3 times, reports that kept being forgotten, filed away, or buried. These reports concerned a family living in complete isolation, about children who looked too much alike, and about a woman who had borne sons by her own brother. When Margaret finally reached the weathered cabin tucked into those shadowed hollows, what she found would haunt her for the rest of her life. She discovered Lily Mae Combs, a woman consumed by a nightmare that had trapped 3 generations of her bloodline. A woman whose existence the state of Kentucky would spend decades trying to erase. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with what time you're watching and where you're from. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Tonight, I'm going to tell you about the most cursed daughter in Kentucky's history. A woman whose name was deliberately scrubbed from public records, whose children were scattered to the winds, and whose very existence became a shameful secret that entire communities agreed to forget. This is the story of Lily Mae Combs and the bloodline that should never have been allowed to grow. What you're about to hear isn't just a tale of mountain folklore or family dysfunction. This is documented history that powerful people worked very hard to bury. Birth certificates were altered, court records were sealed, and entire family trees were systematically destroyed. Because sometimes the truth is so dark, so disturbing, that society decides it's better left buried in the shadows. But shadows have a way of bleeding through. The poisoned bloodline. The Combs family had been living in the remote hollows of eastern Kentucky since before the Civil War. They were what the locals called ridge runners, families who carved out their existence in places so isolated that the outside world simply forgot they existed. No mail was delivered. No roads led to their settlements. No census takers bothered to count them among the living. Samuel Combs built his homestead in 1847 on a plot of land so remote it didn't appear on any official map. He brought with him his 3 children and his wife, Martha. But isolation has a way of breeding its own kind of darkness. When Martha died during a harsh winter in 1863, Samuel made a decision that would curse his bloodline for generations to come. Rather than sending his daughter away or remarrying, Samuel kept 15-year-old Mary Ellen close. Too close. By 1864, Mary Ellen had given birth to her first child, a son whose father's name was never recorded in any official document. The local preacher, if he knew, said nothing. What few neighbors there were turned their eyes away. Before his death in 1878, Mary Ellen would bear Samuel 3 more children. But the bloodline was already poisoned, the pattern had been set. When Mary Ellen's eldest son, Thomas, came of age, he never married outside the family. He never left the hollow. Instead, he followed the only example he had ever known. Thomas took his own sister, Rebecca, as his wife in everything but name. No license was filed. No ceremony was performed. They simply lived as husband and wife in that same isolated cabin, raising children who would never know that other families didn't live this way. Children who thought it was normal for uncles and fathers to be the same person. By 1920, the Combs family tree had become so inbred, so tangled, that tracking the actual bloodlines required investigators to create special charts that would later be hidden and classified in state archives. The children born into this cursed lineage suffered from afflictions that medical professionals of the time couldn't fully understand. Physical deformities, mental disabilities, and a kind of psychological damage that seemed to pass from generation to generation like a genetic curse. Lily Mae's nightmare. And then came Lily Mae, born in 1925 to parents who were also siblings, raised in a world where the lines between family roles had been blurred beyond recognition. Lily Mae Combs entered this world on a cold October night in 1925, delivered by her own grandmother in a cabin that reeked of desperation and kerosene. From the moment she drew her first breath, the sins of her bloodline marked her. Her eyes were too close together, a telltale sign of the genetic damage that ran through her family like poison in a well. Growing up in the Hollow, Lily Mae knew only one reality. Her mother, Sarah, was both her cousin and her parent. Her father, James, was also her uncle. The children in the cabin called each other sister and brother. But the relationships were far more disturbing and complex than those simple words could convey. By the time Lily Mae was 8 years old, she had learned to make herself small and invisible when the adults gathered around the wood stove and passed around mason jars of corn liquor. She had learned to avoid her father's attention when the sun went down. She had learned that screaming brought no help, because in their isolated world, no one was there to hear, and no one who would care if they did. The family survived on what they could grow in the Rocky Mountain soil, hunt and trap. They had no connection to the outside world, no running water, no electricity, except for the occasional visit from a traveling preacher who took one look at the hollow-eyed children and decided his services weren't needed there. Even God, it seemed, had abandoned this place. Education was non-existent. Beyond scratching her name in the dirt with a stick, Lily Mae never learned to read or write. She never learned that there was a world beyond the ridges, a world where children weren't born already broken by the sins of their ancestors, where fathers didn't look at their daughters with hungry eyes, where families lived differently. When Lily Mae turned 12, her childhood, what little innocence remained, came to an abrupt and violent end. Her older brother, William, had been watching her with the same predatory intensity that seemed to run in the men of their bloodline. One autumn night in 1937, while their parents lay in a drunken stupor, William decided to claim what he believed was his birthright. The pattern that had poisoned their family for 3 generations was about to claim another victim. And this time, it would produce offspring that would horrify even the social workers who thought they had seen everything the mountains could hide. Escalating horror. By the spring of 1938, 13-year-old Lily Mae's body began showing the unmistakable signs of what her brother had done to her. In the Hollow, it was simply Tuesday, but in the outside world, this would have triggered interventions, arrests, and investigations. Her father, James, who had committed identical sins with his own sisters, pretended not to notice. Her mother, Sarah, herself a victim of the same cycle, said nothing. The family closed ranks around their shared darkness, creating a wall of silence that would protect their secrets for over a decade. Lily Mae's first son was born in November 1938, delivered on the same blood-stained mattress where she had been born 13 years earlier. The child emerged with severe deformities. His limbs were twisted at unnatural angles, his skull was misshapen. He would never speak, never walk, never develop beyond the mental capacity of an infant. Though no birth certificate was ever filed, the family called him Little Samuel. William, emboldened by the family's acceptance of his actions, continued to use his sister as he pleased. By 1940, Lily Mae had given birth to a second son. This child, whom they named Thomas after his great-grandfather, appeared more physically normal, but from early childhood exhibited disturbing behavioral patterns. He would rock himself violently for hours, make sounds that barely qualified as human language, and bang his head against the cabin walls until blood ran down his face. The isolation that had once protected the Combs family's secrets was beginning to crack. World War II had brought government attention to even the most remote corners of Appalachia. Rationing programs required documentation and registration. Social services were expanding their reach. Draft boards were looking for young men. In 1943, a census taker named Robert Klein ventured into the Hollow, tasked with counting every American citizen for the war effort. What he found in that cabin defied every category on his government forms: adults whose family relationships formed impossible loops, children who couldn't identify their own parents, and at the center of it all, 18-year-old Lily Mae, pregnant again, nursing a toddler while a severely disabled child lay neglected in the corner. Klein's official report, filed with the state of Kentucky, described the situation in clinical terms that barely concealed his horror. But this one, like so many reports before it, was quietly buried in a filing cabinet in Frankfurt. The war was on. Resources were stretched thin. Some problems, the officials decided, were better left undisturbed. That decision would haunt them for years to come. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? By 1945, the Hollow had become a breeding ground for horrors that defied human comprehension. Lily Mae, now 20 years old, had given birth to 4 children by her brother William. Each birth brought new genetic catastrophes, children whose eyes never quite focused on the world around them, children with webbed fingers, children who seized violently at the sound of their own names. The family's isolation was becoming impossible to maintain. Whispers spread through the hollows like wildfire, fueled by the few neighbors who existed in those remote mountains. Tales of children who looked more like creatures than human beings, of inhuman sounds echoing from the Combs cabin at night, of a woman trapped in a nightmare that seemed to have no end. William had grown increasingly violent as the years passed. The corn liquor that dulled his conscience during the day turned him into something monstrous after dark. Lily Mae bore the scars of his rage, a jaw that clicked when she spoke, broken ribs that never healed properly, and fingers that no longer straightened completely, having been bent backwards so many times. But it was the arrival of a traveling photographer in 1947 that finally shattered their wall of secrecy. James Marion, a documentarian capturing the poverty of rural Appalachia for a magazine article, stumbled upon the cabin while following an old hunting trail. What he witnessed there would haunt him for the rest of his life. Marion later described finding Lily Mae sitting on the cabin's rotting porch, holding an infant whose head was twice the normal size. Barely visible in the cabin's darkness behind her, other children moved with the unnatural, jerky motions of broken marionettes. The smell that emanated from inside was indescribable, rotting food, human waste, and something else, something that seemed to reek of genetic despair itself. Marion took no photographs that day. Instead, he drove directly to the county seat and filed a report with the sheriff's department. This time the authorities couldn't ignore what was happening in the hollow. This time there would be consequences. But the Combs family had spent generations perfecting their ability to hide from the outside world. When the sheriff's deputies arrived 3 days later, they found cold ashes in the fireplace and an empty cabin. The family had vanished into the mountains like smoke, taking their cursed bloodline deeper into the wilderness. For 5 years, they would remain ghosts, living in abandoned mining shacks and caves, always one step ahead of the law. But you can't run forever from the darkness you carry inside. The reckoning and the vanishing. The summer of 1952 brought the worst drought in Kentucky's recorded history. Wells that had never failed went dry, and rivers that had run for centuries turned to dust. In their desperate search for water, the Combs family was forced to emerge from the shadows they had called home for 5 years. Margaret Hensley, the social worker whose Ford had wound through those mountain roads, had been tracking reports of the family for months, sightings of figures moving through the forest at night, missing children from neighboring counties, and farmers finding evidence that someone or something had been living in their root cellars and barns. When she finally found them, they had taken shelter in an abandoned coal mine outside Harlan County. The family had grown during their years in hiding. Lily Mae, now 27, had given birth to 2 more children in the darkness of mine shafts and caves. The total count was staggering, 6 children born of incest, each one bearing the mental and physical scars of their poisoned bloodline. Margaret's field notes, discovered decades later in a water-damaged box in the state archives, paint a picture of human suffering that defies comprehension. The children ranged in age from 3 to 14, but none functioned at an age-appropriate level. The eldest, Thomas, had developed into something barely recognizable as human. His behavior was animalistic, his growth stunted, and his communication limited to violent gestures and guttural sounds. William, now in his 30s, had become something out of a backwoods nightmare. Years of living wild had stripped away whatever thin veneer of civilization he had once possessed. His eyes held no recognition of human morality or law. When Margaret attempted to interview him about the children's parentage, he responded with threats so disturbing and graphic that she couldn't bring herself to record them in her official report. But it was Lily Mae who haunted Margaret the most. The woman sitting before her was ancient beyond her years, her face carved with lines of suffering that spoke of horrors no human should endure. When Margaret asked about the children's fathers, Lily Mae simply pointed to William and whispered, "They're all his. Every last one of them." The state of Kentucky faced an unprecedented crisis. What do you do with a family so damaged by generations of incest that the very concept of rehabilitation seemed impossible? How do you prosecute crimes when the perpetrators and victims are so psychologically destroyed that they can barely comprehend the concept of right and wrong? The decision they reached would remain classified for 40 years. The children were quietly removed and scattered across state institutions, their histories erased, their names changed. William was committed to a psychiatric facility where he would spend the rest of his life in solitary confinement. And Lily Mae, the most cursed daughter in Kentucky's history, simply vanished from all official records. The secret that lingers. What happened to Lily Mae Combs in the summer of 1952 remains one of Kentucky's most closely guarded secrets. The official record states simply that she was relocated for treatment. But no facility, no institution, no hospital has any record of her admission. It's as if the state of Kentucky made a collective decision that Lily Mae Combs had never existed at all. The children fared little better. Scattered across institutions from Lexington to Louisville, they were given new histories, new identities, and new names, carefully crafted to hide the truth of their origins. Most never lived to see their 30th birthdays. The genetic damage that ran through their bloodline proved too severe, too deeply embedded in their very DNA to overcome. Thomas, the eldest, died in 1967 at the Western Kentucky State Hospital. Complications from developmental disabilities were listed as the official cause of death. But nurses who worked the ward whispered of something far more disturbing. They spoke of a young man who had never learned to speak, who communicated only through acts of violence so savage that he had to be kept in restraints 24 hours a day. The younger children didn't fare much better. One by one, they succumbed to mysterious illnesses that doctors couldn't explain, organ failures, and seizures, but were clearly linked to the genetic catastrophe of their birth. By 1975, only one remained alive, a daughter named Mary, who lived under an assumed identity with a foster family in Ohio until her death in 2003. But the story doesn't end there. In 1994, a genealogist named Patricia Wells was researching family histories for a client when she stumbled across fragments of the Combs family records in a misfiled folder at the Kentucky State Archives. What she found led her down a rabbit hole of bureaucratic cover-ups, sealed documents, and classified reports that stretched back 50 years. Wells discovered that the state had worked systematically to erase every trace of the Combs family from public records. Property records had been destroyed. Death certificates had been falsified. Birth certificates had been altered. It was as if an entire bloodline had been wiped from history by bureaucratic sleight of hand. Even more disturbing were the medical records Wells uncovered. The children removed from that mineshaft in 1952 had undergone extensive genetic testing. Testing that revealed chromosomal damage so severe it challenged scientific understanding of human genetics. The report suggested that generations of incest had created something that barely qualified as human. A bloodline so corrupted by its own darkness that it represented a dead end of human evolution. Today, if you drive through the hollows of eastern Kentucky, you won't find any mention of the Combs family. The mine where they were discovered has been sealed. The cabin where Lily Mae suffered has long since rotted away. Even the local cemetery refuses to acknowledge the graves that lie unmarked in its forgotten corners. But sometimes, on nights when the mountain mist rolls thick through those shadowed valleys, locals still report hearing things that shouldn't exist. The whispers of a woman whose suffering echoes across decades. The cries of children who were never meant to be born. The reminder that some secrets, no matter how deeply buried, have a way of clawing their way back to the surface. The most cursed daughter in Kentucky's history may have vanished from official records, but her legacy remains. A dark reminder of what happens when humanity's most basic taboos are shattered, and the consequences ripple through generations like a genetic nightmare that refuses to die. Some bloodlines are meant to end. Some stories are buried for a reason. And sometimes the darkest chapters in American history are the ones we agree never to speak of again.